It is the middle of the night in Qing Dynasty, China. You are a traveler. You are tired. You have been walking the mountain road for hours, and the village ahead is still a long walk away. Then you hear it. A bell, ringing in steady, deliberate strokes, not the kind you hear from a temple, but the kind that means something else entirely. The locals know what that sound means. They taught their children what to do if they ever heard it on a night road. Close your eyes, hold your breath. Do not look, because behind that priest moving through the darkness with his arms stretched forward and his eyes wide open and seeing nothing is something that should have stayed in the ground. This is the Jiangshi, China's undead, the hopping vampire, a creature so strange, so specific, and so deeply rooted in real historical practice that it sits in a category entirely its own. Forget everything you know about vampires. No castle, no cape, no seduction in the moonlight. The Jiangshi wears the stiff formal robes of a Qing Dynasty bureaucrat. Its skin is pale, ashen, greenish with age. Its arms are locked forward, rigid with rigor, mortis, unable to bend. Its eyes are open but empty, and it moves the only way its ruined body will allow. It hops, and it is looking for you, not for your blood, not exactly. It wants something far more intimate than that. It wants the energy that makes you alive. And tonight, we go deep into the world of Chinese folklore, Qing Dynasty burial customs, and the strange tragic cosmology that gave birth to one of the most distinctive monsters in human mythology. The name Jiangshi is written with two characters. The first Jiang means stiff, the second Shi means corpse. Stiff corpse. Simple, unflinching, exactly what it is. To understand the Jiangshi, you have to understand what life looked like for ordinary people in Qing Dynasty China. The fear of the unburied dead, however, did not begin with the Qing. It is considerably older. Some accounts trace it as far back as the wars of the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, whose campaigns of conquest left hundreds of thousands of soldiers dead in foreign territory, bodies that could not be brought home, families that could not complete the proper rites. The anxiety was already ancient by the time the corpse-driving trade made it vivid. The dynasty ran from 1644 to 1912, nearly 300 years. It was the last imperial dynasty China would ever have, and for much of that time it was a society built on migration. Men left their home villages by the tens of thousands to find work in cities, on construction projects, in mines, on the roads that stitched the empire together. They crossed mountain ranges and river deltas. They worked for years, sometimes decades, far from everything they knew. And when they died out there, far from home, which happened constantly, from disease, from accidents, from exhaustion, something very specific became a crisis. In Chinese tradition, you do not simply bury the dead wherever they fall. The soul requires proper burial in ancestral soil, in the family grave, in the village where your blood belongs. To be buried in the wrong place, in foreign dirt, far from your ancestors, this was not just sad, it was spiritually catastrophic. It meant your spirit could never rest. It meant you became something unresolved, something dangerous. This belief is not purely historical, it is alive. Every year in the third month of the lunar calendar, Chinese communities across the world observe Qingming, Tomb Sweeping Day. Families travel, sometimes great distances, to tend the graves of their ancestors. They clear the weeds, they burn offerings, they bring food. The message is always the same: we have not forgotten you, you're not lost, you're still part of us. The Jiangshi is what happens when no one comes. So families did what they had to do. They hired men to bring the bodies home. These men were called corpse drivers. And what they did, what they actually did, practically and logistically, on the mountain roads of Qing Dynasty, China, is where the Jiangshi is born. The corpse drivers operated at night, always at night. This was practical. The darkness slowed decomposition in the cooler air. It kept civilian encounters to a minimum, and it meant the strange processions they led could move through the countryside with as little disruption as possible. They walked in pairs, one man at the front of a long bamboo pole, one man at the back. The body or bodies, sometimes several, would be bound upright to the pole, transported between the two carriers. As the carriers walked, the bamboo flexed and bounced with each step. The bodies, bound rigid, moved with it, lurching, bobbing, hopping in the darkness. From a distance on a moonlit road, what would you see? Figures in the dark, moving in strange lurching bounds, arms outstretched for balance, faces blank and upright, a bell ringing ahead of them to clear the road. The priests leading these processions rang bells as a warning. To see a Jiangshi, even one being transported by legitimate means, was considered deeply bad luck. Onlookers were told to turn away, close your eyes, hold your breath. The smell of the dead clings to the living. Some accounts describe the corpse drivers instructing bystanders that the corpses were simply hopping home. The Taoist priest at the front had performed a ritual. The body was going where it needed to go. And in time, as these stories travelled, as they grew in a retelling, as the night road sightings multiplied through a dynasty's worth of rumour, the line between corpse being transported and corpse moving on its own became very thin indeed. There is another theory, darker and more cynical. Some historians believe the corpse driving story was cover, that criminal networks, smugglers, specifically moving contraband through the mountain provinces at night, invented the tale of hopping corpses to frighten away law enforcement and curious travellers. If everyone already knows to close their eyes and hold their breath when they hear a bell in the dark, you can move a great many things through the night unmolested. Whether it was grief ritual or crime that started it, the Jiangshi was walking, and it was not about to stop. To understand what a Jiangshi actually is, what it represents in the deeper logic of Chinese folklore, you need to understand something about how Chinese tradition conceives of the human soul. In Western tradition, the soul is largely singular. You have one, it goes somewhere when you die. In Chinese cosmological thought, it is considerably more complicated. According to classical Chinese belief, a person is governed by not one soul, but 10, 3 hun, the noble heavenly souls, associated with intelligence, virtue and spiritual ascent, and 7 po, the earthly, corporeal souls, tied to the body, the passions, the physical world. The Qing Dynasty scholar Yuan Mei wrote about this directly in his collection Zibu Yu, a vast anthology of ghost stories and supernatural accounts compiled in 1788. He described the Hun as good and intelligent, oriented upward toward heaven. The Po, by contrast, he described as the darker aspect, earthbound, unwilling to release. When a person dies naturally and all is in order, the Hun ascends. The Po dissolves, the body is committed to the earth in a proper place, the cycle completes. But when something goes wrong, when a person dies violently by suicide, by drowning, by murder, when the body is not buried or is buried in the wrong place, or the burial rites are not properly performed, when a black cat leaps over the coffin, when a bolt of lightning strikes the grave, when a person dies holding onto something so tightly, rage, grief, shame, longing, that the Po cannot release its grip on the body. In these cases, the Hun departs, but the Po remains. It takes root in the corpse, it animates it, and the dead walk again. This is the Jiangshi. Not a demon, not a spirit. Something stranger and sadder than either. A body that refuses to understand that it is dead. A soul, or the darkest fragment of a soul that simply cannot let go. The Jiangshi exists in an ecosystem of the unquiet dead. In Chinese folk belief, drawn from both Taoist and Buddhist tradition, the soul that cannot complete its journey becomes what is known as an igai, or hungry ghost, a spirit caught between the world of the living and the world of the dead, with no offerings being made for it, no family tending its grave, no anchor in either realm. Every year, during the 7th lunar month, Ghost Month, the boundary between the living world and the spirit world is said to thin. The hungry ghosts pour through families, leave food and burn paper offerings at their gates, not for their beloved ancestors, but for the nameless ones, the strangers, the unburied, the ones no one is coming back for. The Jiangshi is the worst version of this. Not a ghost drifting through the world, but a body still in it, still moving, still hungry. And unlike a hungry ghost, it does not need offerings. It takes what it needs directly. Let us be precise about what the Jiangshi looks like, because it is unlike anything else in the global canon of undead folklore. The clothing, first in popular depiction, particularly in Hong Kong cinema, which we will return to, the Jiangshi wears the formal robes and round-brimmed hat of a Qing Dynasty mandarin, a bureaucrat uniform, the clothes it was buried in. This is not arbitrary. The Qing Dynasty coincides with the height of the corpse driving trade. The bodies being transported were often workers who had died in the service of the imperial bureaucratic machine, and they were dressed accordingly for their journey home. The skin ranges depending on age. A freshly reanimated Jiangshi may look nearly human, pale, waxy, still. One that has walked for centuries is something else entirely, greenish, moulded, long black fingernails, the smell of earth, and old-time eyes that are open and completely empty. And on its forehead, the yellow paper talisman, written in cinnabar, the red mineral ink of classical Taoist practice, or in folk tradition, chicken's blood. The fulu, a Taoist sealing spell. In folklore, this is what immobilizes a Jiangshi that has been captured or subdued, the talisman pinned to the forehead holding the Po in check, preventing the corpse from acting on its hunger. Because the Jiangshi is hungry. In classical Chinese folklore, what the Jiangshi consumes is qi, vital energy, the animating life force that flows through all living things. The Jiangshi absorbs it through proximity, through breath, through touch, through simply being near the living long enough to drain them. Victims of a Jiangshi do not necessarily die from violence. They waste, they fade, they wake each morning a little less alive than the morning before, until one day they simply do not wake at all. The blood-sucking aspect, the fangs, the biting at the throat came later. It arrived when Western vampire mythology began bleeding into Chinese popular culture through Hong Kong cinema in the 20th century. The original creature feeds on something far less visible and far more terrifying. It feeds on what makes you yourself. And the longer it feeds, the more yang energy it absorbs from the living, the more dangerous it becomes. A freshly risen Jiangshi can only hop. Rigor mortis rules its body. It is slow, stiff, limited to whatever ground it can cover in lurching bounds. But a Jiangshi that has fed, that has walked for months, absorbing qi from the living, begins to loosen. It can run low and fast and wrong-footed, but it can run. The rigor relaxes with enough energy to sustain it. And a Jiangshi that has walked for decades or centuries, one so saturated with stolen yang energy that it has become something else entirely, can fly. Not drift, not float, fly, soaring through the darkness. Ancient accounts describe these creatures descending from the hills to raid villages, taking infants in the night. What begins as a slow, pitiful, hopping corpse can, given enough time and enough victims, become something with no weaknesses left and no limit to its range. This is perhaps the most unsettling thing about the Jiangshi. It is not static, it is not frozen in its moment of death, it grows. Qing Dynasty scholar Ji Xiaolan, whose vast collection of supernatural accounts, the Yue Kaotang Biji, remains the most comprehensive Qing-era record of the undead, organized the causes of Jiangshi reanimation into two broad categories: the recently dead, those who return within days of burial, driven back by unresolved emotion, or improper rites, and the long buried corpses have failed to decompose, lying in the earth for years or decades, accumulating yang energy until the body simply cannot remain still anymore. But the folklore is far more specific than that. There are many doors to which a corpse might rise. A black cat leaping over a coffin before burial. This is one of the oldest and most consistent triggers in the folklore. The cat carrying enough spiritual energy to shock the power back into the body. A lightning strike on a grave. The raw yang energy of the bolt overwhelming the body's stillness and forcing it back into motion. Suicide, drowning, murder, deaths that are sudden, violent and premature leave the soul fractured. The Hun unable to ascend, the Po unable to release, the body becomes a prison that the Po haunts endlessly and without purpose. And then there is the simplest cause of all, not being buried in the right place. The migrant worker who fell ill in a city 1,000 miles from his village, the soldier who died in a battle on the wrong side of the empire, the body in foreign soil with no ancestors' bones nearby, with no rituals performed by the right people at the right time. In Chinese cosmological thought, these deaths are not just tragic, they are unfinished, and unfinished things have a way of continuing. Finally, and this detail appears in later folklore, particularly in the Mr. Vampire films, a Jiangshi can pass its condition on those bitten or drained begin to change gradually over days, the Po within them slowly displaced by the hunger, a new Jiangshi assembling itself in the body of the living. It is 1842, a merchant named Wei is travelling home to Hunan province after season's work in Guangdong. He has done this road before. He knows it well enough that he trusts it in the dark. He hears a bell when it is still far behind him. He stops walking. He has heard stories, everyone in Hunan has heard stories, but he has never been on the road when a bell rings. He tells himself it is a temple, a festival procession, something normal. He turns around. He sees the lantern first, a pale yellow smear in the fog. Then the priest beneath it, robes moving, bells swinging. Then behind the priest, that first one. Then as his eyes adjust, three shapes moving in the darkness. Their arms are forward, their movements are wrong. Stiff, vertical, rhythmic in a way that does not match walking, does not match running, does not match anything Wei has ever seen a body do while it is alive. The priest sees Wei standing frozen in the road. He shouts, not unkindly, but with the urgency of a man who has done this 100 times and knows what comes next. Close your eyes, hold your breath, turn away from the road. Wei does not breathe. The bell has not stopped, the priest has not stopped, but the thudding, one of the sets of footsteps has. Something is very close to him. He can smell it, earth and cold air, and something older, something wrong. He does not know if it is inches away or feet. He does not open his eyes to find out. He does not breathe for what feels like a full minute after the sound is gone. When he finally opens his eyes, the road is empty again, the bell is gone, the fog sits where it always sat. He walks the rest of the way home in full daylight, after sleeping in the ditch until sunrise. He never travels that road at night again. Chinese folklore is nothing if not practical. If a Jiangshi can be made, it can be unmade, and the tradition offers a remarkably detailed toolkit for the task. The forehead talisman, the fulu, a strip of yellow paper inscribed in cinnabar or in folk tradition, chicken blood with a binding Taoist sealing charm. Pressed to the Jiangshi's forehead, it immobilizes the creature immediately. It does not destroy it, it simply holds the Po in check, forcing the body to stillness. In folklore and film alike, the talisman is the primary weapon of any Taoist priest working a Jiangshi case. Sticky rice, one of the more unexpected entries. Glutinous rice thrown at a Jiangshi, or even placed at the threshold of a home, draws out the corpse's dark energy, absorbing and neutralizing it. The logic is consistent with Chinese symbolic thought. Rice is life-giving, yang dominant, associated with sustenance and health. The darkness in the Jiangshi cannot coexist with it. The roosters crow. Dawn. The call of the rooster. The Jiangshi, like many creatures of Chinese folklore, is bound to darkness, not merely to night, but to yin energy itself. When the rooster crows, the yang flood of morning begins, and the Jiangshi's power collapses. It must return to stillness or face dissolution. Peachwood. In classical Chinese belief, the peach tree is one of the most powerful talismanic plants in existence. It is associated with immortality, with virtue, and with the expulsion of malevolent forces. A sword of peachwood, a staff, a threshold plank, any of these can repel or harm a Jiangshi. Mirrors, specifically the Bagua mirror, the octagonal feng shui mirror, associated with reflective spiritual power. The Jiangshi, according to the Benkao Gangmu, the great Qing Dynasty medical compendium compiled by Li Shijin in 1578, is terrified of its own reflection. The mirror confronts the dead with what they are. The Po cannot bear to see it. Holding your breath. This is perhaps the most distinctly Chinese element of all. The Jiangshi does not hunt by sight, it hunts by breath, by the exhalation of living qi. If you stop breathing entirely in its presence, it cannot locate you. You become, in the most literal sense, temporarily indistinguishable from the dead. Counting compulsion. Like many creatures from folklore traditions around the world, from Romanian vampires to Germanic spirits, the Jiangshi can be distracted by scattered small objects, coins, seeds, rice grains. The creature is compelled to count them and will stand there counting until sunrise or until something breaks its focus. The black donkey's hoof, one of the more specific and obscure protections. Striking a Jiangshi with the hoof of a black donkey is said to be particularly effective. The exact symbolic logic is debated, but black donkeys appear repeatedly in Chinese apotropaic tradition, their hooves considered especially potent against the undead. The sheer variety of these protections tells us something important about the Jiangshi's place in Chinese folk belief. This is not a creature from literary tradition alone, not a theologian's invention or a scholar's abstraction. This is folklore that lived in villages, that was taught to children, that informed the way people laid thresholds, grew peach trees near doors, and made sure never to look at a night procession on a mountain road. The Jiangshi was real to the people who believed in it, not metaphorically real. Real? For most of its history, the Jiangshi lived where all folklore lives, in oral tradition, in local practice, in the stories parents told children when they needed to explain why you do not linger on mountain roads after dark. Then, in 1985, it exploded. Mr. Vampire Yung Si Sin Sang in Cantonese arrived in Hong Kong cinemas and became an immediate, enormous sensation, directed by Ricky Lau and produced by the legendary Sammo Hung. It took the classical Jiangshi and placed it in a comedy horror martial arts framework that was unlike anything the genre had seen. The film's Jiangshi had the talisman, the hopping gait, the Qing Dynasty robes, all the classical markers, but it also had wire-through fight choreography, bumbling apprentice priests, and a tonal blend of genuine dread and slapstick comedy that somehow worked completely. Mr. Vampire spawned a franchise that ran through the late 1980s and into the early 1990s alongside dozens of imitators for a generation of viewers across East Asia, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, Southeast Asia. The Jiangshi became as iconic a figure as Dracula was in the West merchandise, animation, video games. The creature achieved a cultural saturation that its classical folkloric roots could never have predicted. Nowhere was this more pronounced than in Japan. The 1985 film crossed the sea and became a sensation, particularly with children. The Japanese version, Jiangshi, embedded itself into an entire generation's pop culture. A dedicated TV show, Rai Rai Jiangshi's, aired in 1988, Bandai produced Famicom games based on the creature. The hopping vampire appeared in Super Mario Land and other major Japanese video games, a creature from Qing Dynasty burial practice, now jumping across the screens of millions of Japanese children. The Jiangshi never fully left. In 2012, nearly 30 years after Mr. Vampire, a new revival swept Japan. The idol group 99 starred in a TV Tokyo show called How How Jiangshi Girl and released a music video featuring the entire group performing the creature's signature hopping gait in unison, arms outstretched, stiff-legged, bouncing together on screen. A Qing Dynasty burial corpse had become a pop dance move twice over. The Jiangshi also travelled through older, quieter channels across the diaspora roots of the Chinese people. Into Vietnam, into Southeast Asia, a cognate creature appears in local folklore. In Vietnam, the Quang Ti carries the same name, the same cosmological logic, the same fear of the improperly buried dead. Where Chinese communities settled, the Jiangshi followed. He was not just a monster, he was a piece of cultural memory that people carried with them. And here's the interesting tension that the cinema tradition created. The cinematic Jiangshi added elements that classical folklore never contained. The blood drinking borrowed from Western vampire mythology. The contagion mechanic, the Jiangshi virus, borrowed from zombie genre logic. The aristocratic bearing, the sense of ancient malevolence. The original creature is not malevolent. It is not ancient and cunning and purposeful. It is a lost thing. A fragment of a person trapped in a body that refuses to surrender, going through the motions of living because the Po does not know how to stop. There is a line from the Mr. Vampire film, much beloved by scholars who write about the Jiangshi, where the Taoist master explains what makes vampires. They are, he says, those who die with one last breath still inside them, whether it be regret or anger. That is, I think, the truest thing anyone has said about the Jiangshi. Not a monster. In the end, a feeling. The feeling of something unfinished. The feeling of the door not quite closed. The feeling, ancient and universal, of not being able to let go. Every great monster tells us something true about the culture that made it. The Jiangshi is no exception. Chinese culture has one of the deepest and most elaborate traditions of ancestor veneration in human history. The dead are not gone, they are present. They require attention, offerings, the performance of specific rites at specific times. They can bless the living if honoured, they can harm the living if neglected. The Jiangshi is what happens when that contract is broken. When someone dies in the wrong place or in the wrong way, or without the proper rites being performed and no one comes to fix it. The Jiangshi is homesickness made flesh. It is the migrant worker who died 3 provinces away from his ancestors and was never brought home. It is the soldier who fell on the wrong side of a battlefield. It is every person who died before their time and left something undone. This anxiety, the unburied dead rising, the improper death producing something monstrous, is not uniquely Chinese. Half a world away, Norse tradition produced a Draugr, a reanimated corpse rising from its barrow, sighted far from its burial site, growing more powerful with time. The fears are different in their details. The root is the same: die badly, rise badly. And in Southeast Asia, where the Pontianak roams, the woman who died in childbirth with everything unfinished, the same anxiety takes a different shape. The specific cause of unrest differs. The result is always the same: something that was human, that had a name and a family and a place in the world, reduced to hunger, emotion, and the inability to stop. The corpse-driving trade, those strange men with their bamboo poles and their bells and their night roads, were performing an act of profound cultural compassion. Bring the dead home. Let them rest where they belong, because if you don't, they will find their own way, and the way they find will not be gentle. There is something worth sitting with in that. In an age of globalization, of mass migration, of millions of people dying far from everything that shaped them, the Jiangshi's central anxiety feels less like ancient folklore and more like something entirely contemporary. The fear is not really the hopping. The hopping is almost beside the point. The fear is dying somewhere you don't belong. The fear is being lost, and the long, terrible, inexorable process of making your way home. The Jiangshi is still out there, not on mountain roads in Hunan, though who knows, but in the wider cultural imagination, in video games, in manga, in a generation of East Asian horror that traces its DNA directly to those bamboo poles moving through the fog. It is one of the few monsters in global folklore whose origin story is simultaneously rational and terrifying. We know exactly why the Jiangshi exists. We know it started with grief and logistics and the human need to bring the dead home. And we know that the night you hear the bell on the road, the hollow rhythmic bell that gets closer and closer and does not stop. You close your eyes, you hold your breath, and you do not look. If the Jiangshi has you thinking about the wider world of vampire mythology, you are not alone. The Jiangshi is just one thread in a global tapestry of blood-drinking, life-force-stealing undead that spans nearly every culture on Earth. We are going deep into that world soon, very deep. In the meantime, if you want more dark folklore from around the world, the Pontianak episode is waiting for you. Southeast Asian, female, extraordinarily dangerous, and the story behind her is one of the most genuinely disturbing things this channel has covered. Subscribe if you haven't, leave a comment telling me which culture's undead tradition you want covered next, and I will see you in the dark.